Hello and welcome to another T-Rex Talk. My name is Isaac Botkin, and this is another one of our audio-only episodes, although I probably shouldn't call them that. That sounds like you're missing out on something. You're missing out on video, but what you're actually getting is a podcast exclusive. You're getting an exclusive episode. That makes it sound like you're getting something extra, so much better marketing. In this episode, I want to talk about how night vision is made for a couple reasons. The first is that when I asked you guys for suggestions on different stuff that you would like me to cover, that was one of the things that multiple people asked for. The other reason is I've been too busy to really think about this podcast until now, which I'm not going to tell you when now is, but it is remarkably close to the Monday launch date of this particular podcast. Since the non-podcast exclusive episodes get done live, I should record these ahead of time, but I haven't been doing that. I've been recording these pretty much last minute. And a good topic for last minute is how night vision is made, because I'm basically just going to borrow somebody else's research. I'm going to borrow the research of David Kitson, who is an independent night vision researcher who has studied this process of manufacturing night vision in way greater depth than I have. And on that note, I want to recommend a couple of resources for learning about night vision stuff. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, you're obviously aware of T-Rex Arms, so you already know Lucas Botkin. You already know that Lucas Botkin is a great proponent of night vision, and he demonstrates the use of night vision for a whole bunch of different stuff and different types of night vision and IR lasers and flashlights. So he has done an awful lot to educate people on night vision and normalize night vision from a practical perspective, from a shooting perspective especially. But there are a couple of guys that you may not know about. One of them is Nicholas Chen, who writes content for the Firearm blog, and he does some other stuff as well. He's also a night vision researcher, but he does a great job of stranger, weirder, more esoteric stuff. So he gets things that may not be as commonplace. I mean, night vision is already not particularly commonplace, but he gets weird old night vision from other countries. He gets bits of kit that you may not have come across, and he does a pretty good job of testing those things and does an excellent job of documenting his research. And he does interesting stuff. Like a couple weeks ago, he was writing for the Firearm blog his experiment in building an Anvis 10 out of parts. And it's not something that he recommends that the reader necessarily do to save money, but it's a great way to understand that particular night vision device, what it does, why it does what it does, stuff like that. So he gets focused on more of the nitty-gritty of the kit than the actual use of it in the way that Lucas does. But I find it very interesting. And again, he does a great job of documenting what it looks like and what it does and comparing different things. And then the other person that I want to mention to you gets even deeper into the nitty-gritty, and his name is David Kitson down in Australia. He is not to be confused with David Chipman, of course, former ATF agent who, at the time of this recording, is going to be potentially appointed by the U.S. Senate to be the head of the ATF. So call your senators, if that hasn't happened already, and tell them why that should not happen. So David Kitson is the independent night vision researcher he doesn't really have a particular place. You will find, if you research night vision, you search the internet, you will find that he has written the most useful materials on Quora, on AR15.com, various other places and forums. You will just find him popping up, providing insight and information. But as far as I know, he doesn't have a particular website. He's not publishing this in a way that is really collected in a certain place. But you will find him as you search for these things. And most of this that I'm going to talk about comes from a thread on AR15.com where he describes what is inside of a night vision tube, inside of an image intensifier tube. I'm going to paraphrase because if you are really interested in this, you should go and read it and look at the pictures. But if you need to listen to a podcast and you just want a little brief explanation of these parts, I will do as best as I can to make it work in audio format. But basically, an image intensifier tube, it has chemicals inside that turn photons that go into the tube into electrons. And this is not a technology that is new. Vacuum tubes that do things like this are coming up on 100 years old. This technology goes back a long ways, and it was used to create night vision as early as World War II. And the way that those tubes worked is they didn't actually amplify the light that existed a whole lot, but what they did was they turned infrared light that the human eye could not see into visible light that the human eye could see. So there were night scopes on a few rifles, but mostly on vehicles, because these were pretty large systems with significant power requirements. But there was basically a gigantic infrared bulb that would illuminate the battlefield with infrared light, and then this scope would allow the sniper to see that infrared light. So it wasn't a starlight scope per se. It wasn't amplifying light. It was just allowing them to have a gigantic infrared searchlight that the enemy could not see. So this technology is old. It's been around for a while, but there have been some advances in the way that these tubes are created, and it's kind of amazing just how complex, and it's almost alchemy the way that these things are made. So the first thing he points out is that he's going to be talking about a Gen 3 image tube. And then the other thing that he points out is that, just for reference, the thickness of a human hair is about 100 microns. So just think about your hair being 100 microns thick. So the photocathode is itself a piece of glass that's about 5 millimeters thick, and they grow a crystal on one side of it. And that is itself the photocathode. That crystal converts photons into electrons. And it does that in a way that basically when a photon is absorbed by a metal atom, the energy absorbed makes other electrons do other things, and they kind of ping off. If there's enough energy, then they ping off. And I don't really know how to explain this stuff. I'm not actually a scientist. But what basically they're growing a crystal on one side of a really thin piece of glass. And they make this photocathode out of gallium arsenide these days. It's a pretty expensive semiconductor. It's used in a bunch of different electronics. The most effective and efficient solar panels are made out of this, but they're very expensive, so you don't see them on the market very much. And they grow this photocathode on the glass, kind of like they're growing a crystal. It's a crystalline structure, and it builds as they puff this gallium arsenide vapor over the surface of the glass, and it just accumulates over time. They put some other chemicals on there too in different layers. I'm not going to get into those, but the gallium arsenide, the active layer that does all of the work, is really thin. It is somewhere between 1 and 1.8 microns thick. So just to remind you, that is like 1/100th of the width of one of your human hairs. That's how much of this stuff that they have to lay down. And it has to be evenly laid, very, very smooth and very perfect for this to work. Now you probably understand why imperfect night vision tubes exist. And then they have to add another layer of something on top of that gallium arsenide. It is cesium, and they lay it down 1 atom thick, which is crazy. And then they oxidize it with oxygen, and then you have your photocathode. It's now working. And again, this is an ancient type of device. The tubes that were being made 100 years ago didn't have this level of precision or accuracy. They didn't use quite as exotic a material as this. But the principle is basically the same. We're just creating it to a much tighter set of tolerances with materials that react a little bit better. But essentially, all of the photocathode stuff is old technology. And the next thing that comes along is the microchannel plate, which actually amplifies all of the electrons that you have coming off of that photocathode. And that is pretty new. I don't actually know how old these things are, because a lot of the development of some of this stuff is now specific to night vision, which means that it is more or less classified or top secret during types of its development, but definitely decades, many decades. That's how long microchannel plates have been around. And again, it amplifies the electrons that are coming off of the plate. So photons hit the photocathode plate and get turned into electrons. Visible photons, infrared photons. It Doesn't matter. They all get turned into the same type of electrons. And then the microchannel plate amplifies those. It takes one electron hitting the microchannel plate and turns it into thousands of electrons, which helps brighten the image to your eye. And the way that you make this microchannel plate is really complicated. They take an etchable glass, and then they surround it with another kind of glass, and then they pull this out once it is heated into a thin strand, and then they fold it over and pull it out and fold it over and pull it out and fold it over. So there's one strand becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 16, etc., 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 until they end up with a rod that is made of millions of glass fibers. And then they slice this into slices that are about 0.3 millimeters thick. And then they etch these with an acid that will dissolve the etchable glass, but not the other glass, which is a regular lead silicate glass. And then you end up with this fascinatingly complex structure. Millions and millions and millions of tiny, tiny holes appear in this glass plate once the etching is complete. And those are the microchannels, which they then coat the whole thing with conductive layers of things. And again, this is a coating that has to be unbelievably thin so that those unbelievably tiny holes remain holes. I have no idea the chemical and electrical processes that this actually enables. I just know that it works. You should read some more of David Kitson's stuff if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of understanding exactly what electrochemical magic is going on. There also has to be an ion barrier film on top of the microchannel plate. This is very important. And you make that by floating some lacquer on top of water, and then you lower the frame that's holding that lacquer, which is floating on the surface of the water, down onto a supporting frame, and then you let the lacquer dry. So that is apparently the best way to get that film as thin as possible. And then you put some aluminum oxide on that. Of course, you would want to put aluminum oxide on there and sinter all of this together. So now you've got an aluminum oxide film that is like 0.0003 microns thick on one side of your microchannel plate, as you would. Obviously you need to do that. And that's crazy. That is unbelievably thin, 3 nanometers thick. And we're now actually at such tiny scales that some of these coatings are within a quarter of a wavelength of light, and some of these sizes of things that are working electrically are manipulating individual electrons. And this is all being done not at a digital level, but with just bits of chemicals that are heated and glued together in specific ways at just tiny, tiny scales. So now the microchannel plate is spitting out tens of thousands of electrons for every electron that we get from the photocathode tube. And those electrons go off and they hit the screen. The screen is actually fairly simple compared to everything that we've just talked about. The screen is a lot like your standard CRT monitor or cathode ray television set. If you're as old as I am, you actually remember these television sets. They were not HD. They were not flat. Inside, they had an electron gun, and they blasted electrons very carefully, but they blasted electrons at a phosphor screen, and those electrons caused those phosphors to glow, and that was how you actually got a screen, a visible image on your television set, or inside of the viewfinder of your video camera. Now, obviously, we don't use these types of screens for televisions or for viewfinders anymore, but we still use them for night vision, and we make these screens, I say we humans make these screens underwater, as you probably already guessed. You pour all of the stuff that you need to go into the screen into water, and you just shake it up and mix it and allow it to settle, and that allows it to settle very evenly and very consistently as little tiny particles onto a glass plate or a fiber plate that you're actually making your screen out of. And then once you let those tiny little particles, those tiny little phosphor particles, you're supposed to be using 8 micron particles, and you're wanting your screen to be 8 microns thick. So basically, the microparticles are little bits of phosphor that are going to glow when they're hit by electrons. They're basically pixels. Think of them as analog pixels. that are 8 microns wide. As soon as you let them settle at the perfect thickness onto that screen, you add a bunch of chemicals to sort of bind those to the things. You let it dry. So that gives you a resolution. They're not actually pixels, so we don't talk about this in pixels, but it gives you a resolution of just over 100 line pairs per millimeter. So that's pretty similar to the resolution of the microchannel plate. The holes in the microchannel plate are also kind of like pixels, and that dictates the resolution of what you're actually getting detail-wise. Then you put the screen into a chamber filled with argon gas, and you cover it with a bit of aluminum, and there's some more layers, and there's some more coatings, and then you get your finished phosphor screen. The electrons hitting these individual micron particles, these individual bits of phosphor, and when that happens, they fluoresce, they light up, and then they keep glowing for a little while. That's phosphorescence. They glow for 1.2 milliseconds if you use the P43 phosphor. How long the phosphor glows for after it has been hit by an electron is a factor in how bright the image looks to you. So every piece of this puzzle, to how efficient the photocathode is at turning photons into electrons, how efficient the microchannel plate is at amplifying those electrons, how much light you actually get out of your screen when it gets hit by those electrons, all of these things have a major effect on the light amplifying capabilities of the finished thing. And the finished thing, I would say, also needs to be assembled. So those 3 pieces need a couple of other things added to them. They need a fiber twist to flip the image over, because that simplifies the optics if you want simplified optics. And then you also need a power supply. The power supply is really simple and easy because it takes 3 volts coming in, and then it turns that into, there needs to be about 5,000 volts going to the screen, and just lots and lots of voltage, different voltages going to each part of this assembly at low amperages. But those 3 volts need to get ramped up to thousands of volts to operate all of these components. A finished image intensifier tube uses so little power, it's amazing. Should be about 40 milliamps at 3 volts. And then you put all of these parts together, and now it gets even more archaic sounding. You have to put these together in a vacuum, and then you need to activate certain things, oxidize certain things. You have to fit parts together with ceramic rings. These are what are referred to as the rings of power, of course. They have to be created by Sauron on Mount Doom in order to get the temperatures at the right height. And then, obviously, some of the rings are for elves and dwarves, etc. You got to bind things together with indium, which is a good seal for all of the air tightness. And technically, the indium seals are the rings of power because the metal tabs sticking out of those do provide electrical power from the power supply to all of the individual components. And then you put it into whatever case it needs to go in that will take the lenses that you want to use and the actual electrical power that you're going to be running it off of. So that's the whole bit. Simple, easy, straightforward. Yeah, nothing to it. So all of those steps and that incredibly painstaking work that is done at such minute levels explains why night vision costs so much. But what it doesn't really explain is why night vision is still being done in this archaic, almost Tolkien-esque, magical way. And the reason for that is that there has been an incredible amount of focus on this particular application and this particular technology by the United States military, and the private sector has generally focused in other areas. So the private sector has completely and totally moved away from photocathode tubes in photography and videography and various other types of sensors because there are other sensors that are better at this. However, those sensors tend to lack the sensitivity that you can get with a tube, and so there's an area in which these tubes are still the best fit. They are still the best tool in the toolbox for what certain people are trying to do. So it's easy to see why the military is willing to put a lot of money into this old technology, squeezing every last bit of resources out of it, squeezing every last bit of performance out of it, because the cost of doing so, even for a niche application, is really fairly minimal for them. Now, that being said, they're already moving to digital night vision in a bunch of different areas. And some of the interesting stuff that's being trialed, I want to talk about this in a future episode, is fascinating. And I don't actually know at this point what the performance is compared to a really excellent top-of-the-line Gen 3 scope. But there are some certain capabilities that come with digital that make it really valuable, even over the analog night vision stuff that is at a performance level as good as you can get. But as far as you or I are concerned, we don't really have access to that kind of cutting-edge stuff. We have access to really excellent Gen 3 night vision tubes, and we have access to a lot of information on how they're made and how they're used, and a number of civilian shooters pushing them to their limits and using them for different things, and that's great. But at the same time, I think all of us feel like digital night vision should be right around the corner. There are insane developments with digital cameras. There are insane developments like with cell phone cameras. I have a cell phone camera that shoots 4K video on a sensor that is the size of a grain of rice, a cell phone screen that is an insane resolution that would look really good inside of a VR headset. So there is tremendous advancement in camera technology, tremendous advancement in display technology, computing technology, and so this stuff is coming, and we can see little bits and hints of what will be in the future when we look at military programs, and we can see little hints of what might be coming when we look at certain consumer products like that Psyonix Aurora, which is a very cheap alternative to a Gen 2 tube, but it's not quite a Gen 3 tube in its sensitivity. And being digital, it's a completely different animal, so it has certain advantages over an analog tube, like the ability to record. It is more durable in certain ways. It doesn't have a limited shelf life. It doesn't have a limited operational life, which technically tubes do. I forgot to mention that. But these electrochemical devices that use fancy properties of chemicals to turn photons into electrons, they actually burn up over time. And the newer tubes last an awful lot longer than the old tubes, but they have limits to how long that they can actually operate before some of those chemicals are burned up, and they have limits to how much light you can expose them to before they actually get physically burned on the inside, because those layers of chemicals are incredibly delicate. But now I'm kind of rambling. Basically, the point is that all of us would love digital night vision to come along and be better and cheaper than the analog options, but that really isn't how it's going to happen. When digital cameras came out and I stopped using tube cameras, they were better, but way more expensive for a long time. It wasn't until much later that they were better and cheaper. Now, there were some cheaper video cameras that were not better, but for better and cheaper to happen at the same time, better and cheaper both had to happen individually. And I think that we are seeing that happen. The Psyonix Aurora is way cheaper than analog night vision, but not better. And then in the high rarefied atmosphere of top-tier military development, we can see that there are some devices that are almost certainly better and absolutely certainly not cheaper. The next few steps are going to be bringing those two things together so that digital night vision that comes along is in fact better and cheaper for us civilian end user types. Even though that day is inevitable and that day is coming, I still think there's going to be people using analog tubes, not just military surplus guys, but I think there's going to be military units using analog tubes because they do offer such amazingly unparalleled characteristics in certain ways, not just the sensitivity, but the sheer lack of latency and the just tiny amounts of power that they use up are incredibly useful for certain military applications. So there's always going to be guys out there that want to keep shooting film, even though digital cameras have surpassed them. There's still going to be guys out there that want to use analog tubes for certain things because, let's be honest, they are like a magic telescope. Photons go in, get turned to electrons, and photons come out. There are no issues with refresh rate. There are no issues with data loss, with shutter sync. There are no issues with some of the digital technologies that are kind of unavoidable. They have to be addressed at a computational level, which creates heat, takes incredibly larger amounts of electrical power. So there is something that is still distinctly unique and magical about an analog tube that works like a magic telescope on almost no battery power, even when I compare it to my best case scenario digital night vision scope. So it's worth knowing how these things work, because they're just so unique and they're just so high performance and they're just so fascinating to study. And I think that they are going to be around for some time. The same is kind of true in the filmmaking world. So film is something that has been completely replaced by digital cameras for the most part, but there's still a few auteurs out there. There's still people like Christopher Nolan, who demands that his movies be shot on film because of the way that it looks and the way that he likes it and nostalgic, fuzzy feelings that he gets. But film is so expensive and difficult and hard to use that basically anybody with a budget or any other particular constraints would prefer to use a digital camera. The digital camera is superior in certain other ways, and economics is a major factor there. So if you are Christopher Nolan, the cost of shooting on film, even the cost of, say, shooting on 70 millimeter Eastman Kodak IMAX film that it's just unbelievably expensive to shoot and deliver, that still is only 0.1% of his budget. So that's a pretty easy decision to make from a financial perspective. On the other hand, if you are a guerrilla filmmaker who is trying to take on the big studios, the cost of your camera package is a gigantic percentage of your budget. And it's kind of similar in this way. If you are a superpower military and you're sending a bunch of top-tier operators into somebody else's country to extract a high-value target, the night vision budget for that operation is, 0.1% of the actual material cost of what's going on. But if you're like me, your night vision setup is basically as expensive as everything else that you have. So my plate carrier and plates and magazines and rifle and optic and weapon light, roughly on par with my night vision monocular cost-wise. It's like 50% of my loadout. That's it for today's episode. I'm sorry that it was as geeky as it was. I find that stuff interesting, and hopefully you guys too. If you've listened this far, then you must. I can't think of any other reason that you would still be hanging around. But next week we will have another topic. I'm not sure exactly what it'll be. It'll possibly be the future of digital night vision and some of the research that's happening there, or it'll be something else that came up over the week that I decided to talk about last minute. And feel free to contact us at team@trex-arms.com for comments on this show or recommendations for future topics for future shows. And again, let me know who you guys would like to hear from so that there's some other voices on here. I think that would be tremendously useful and edifying to everyone. But thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you later.